Hey guys, hope you're doing well. Hope you had a good long weekend and you enjoyed the nice weather. So, I'd like to just review what we've talked about since we started the ecology unit. So, very first thing we did when we were introducing ecology was, besides defining it, talk about abiotic factors and biotic factors. And then we went into some of the biotic factors, which is predation, competition, mutualism, parasitism, and commensalism. Then we looked at the abiotic factors like the water cycle, the carbon cycle, and the nitrogen cycle. So, ecology is the study of how organisms interact with each other and their environment. And so, we have a pretty good representation here of how organisms interact with each other and how they interact with their environment. So, as a reminder, we'll look at what is a biotic factor and abiotic factor just really quickly. So, biotic, bio, anything that is living, like the plants, this bee here, this happy frog, the grass here, and then abiotic, anything that's non living. So, water in this lake here, water in the clouds, um, water that is running down this mountain and in the mountain itself, the dirt and rocks in the soil are abiotic, but the soil has lots of decomposers. So those, which I'll just do in a, let's make that little, we'll just call those worms and bacteria and all sorts of things. Those are the decomposers. Those would be biotic, right? So if ecology is a study of how living things interact with each other and how they interact with non-living things, basically those are our two questions. Well, how do they do that? What's happening? Well, in this picture here, we can kind of tell there's something going on between these two. And from our previous lesson, we know that these two have a mutualistic relationship. So this bird is actually on this buffalo for a reason. It's picking off all these little insects that are living on the fur of this buffalo and eating them. And then in turn, the buffalo doesn't have to worry about all of these blood sucking insects all the time. So they're both benefiting from that relationship. Now, how do living things interact with non-living things? Why are we looking at this pile of sticks in this body of water? Well, what you don't see is that a beaver actually created this. It chopped down all these trees that were probably right here and created a nice little dam. So not only can it go underneath, and that's where it lives over winter and stores its food, but it's changing the flow of all this water. Either it stops the flow completely, or it just reroutes the direction of the water flow. So there's lots of ways that organisms can interact with each other and how they can interact with their environment. Okay, let's look at this picture. So we have a mama bear with her three adorable cubs. We've got two wolves. One wolf is radio collared, which means that biologists just put a radio collar on it to study it. And then we've got some ravens here that are pretty brave. And then this right here is probably an elk or some kind of deer carcass here that they're looking like they're both wanting to eat. So, by using what I know about this, the first one I can see is competition, right? So the first biotic interaction I see is competition. Both of these organisms, the bear and the wolves, maybe the ravens, are both all competing to get to this food source. There is another one I see too. Obviously, the elk had to die in some way. So this picture doesn't really let us know, but either the bear or the wolves killed this elk, or maybe it died by disease, and actually a bacteria or virus killed the elk. Who knows? But it's being predated on by any and all of these organisms. Another thing we see, probably more like commensalism. If you need a reminder of what that is, Make this a little bigger so you can see it. What I'm calling commensalism is probably these ravens follow, to some extent, these wolves, especially after they've made a kill. And so a lot of times they may not go in right during their eating like these prey ravens are, but they will scavenge the leftovers and eat the leftovers once the bigger animals like a wolf or a bear leaves. So the wolf and bear, if they've left it because a lot of the bigger pieces of meat are gone, they're not really benefiting or being negatively affected by the crows eating the rest of their hunt. But the ravens and the crows are definitely benefiting, right? So that's commensalism. Another thing we see here is obviously water cycle, right? And Yellowstone has a pretty cool relationship with water. We won't get into a whole lot, maybe a little bit later, but obviously there's lots of uses of this water here. We know that carbon cycle is happening because we have lots of plants in the background back here that's producing oxygen, and these organisms are taking in oxygen and then actually kicking out carbon dioxide. And then we also have nitrogen cycle represented here, which may be less obvious. Go here. So this carcass and even like dead plants that you may not see, those are going into the soil and being decomposed by things like, earthworms, fungi, bacteria, insects. Those are decomposing and basically eating up that matter and then putting the nutrients back into the soil, a nutrient including nitrogen. So just within this one picture, and there might be even more things going on, but just in this one picture, we can see all these biotic and abiotic cycles and processes and interactions happening. Now, when we talk about food chains and food webs, it's a little more simplified. So a food chain is basically it has its name because like links in a chain, it just goes one direction and shows how each one relates to the next, right? So get my right cursor here. There. So this is an aspen tree right here. So elk will typically eat aspen tree. Well, you know what? I did that wrong. We'll eat the leaves off of the tree, and then typically a wolf will eat the elk. Now, this does not include the bear or the raven, which we saw in this picture here. So a food chain just shows how a few organisms obtain their nutrients. So the wolf eats the elk eats the aspen. So what's nice is that you get to see a direct relationship of how if something happened to aspen trees, this species would be affected because it eats the species that eats that species, right? So you can still make some good theories about if this species was totally exterminated, wolves would be endangered. Now we can do the same thing with bears, right? So a food chain just contains these three species of the aspen tree, the elk, and the bear, or if I were to switch any of these other ones. Another example would be this one's actually a marine food chain, which is kind of cool. But same idea, and that this gives kind of a more detailed explanation about how these food chains are structured. So primary producers are the first ones on the bottom, plants, because they produce their own energy from the sun. Typically a sun, let's just draw it for this way. Oh, perfect. Great. Beautiful. So plant gets its energy from the sun. An herbivore like this grasshopper will eat the plant. This little mouse will eat the grasshopper, snake eats the mouse, and then this hawk eats the snake. So all of these are connected here. Same thing in the marine food chain. Phytoplankton, which is very, very small. They can create their own energy. Zooplankton may prey on phytoplankton. And then finally, you get into some carnivorous fish that eat zooplankton, and then something like a killer whale that will eat the fish. So food chain, pretty simple, pretty straightforward. What about a food web? Then it gets a little more messy. So we use this red here. So we have our aspen tree. Well, we know that the elk eat the aspen tree. We also know that beavers will also eat aspen. Elk will also eat this grass here too. And then I know that wolves eat elk and also bear eat elk. But also, I don't know if you knew this, bears will also eat grass. And then everything. Maybe I'll just do this. So all of this, these are all the decomposers. We have our earthworms, our fungi, our mushrooms, and then these are called sow bugs. But this represents any insect that is a decomposer. They will decompose everything on this page here. So that's more of like a food web. It shows the interactions of how nutrients are passed through all organisms and not just a few. It also includes these decomposers, so you can see nutrients are being recycled back into the earth. So a neater example would be this desert biome food web. So in the center, the first thing you may see is bacteria. And what they mean by that is, oh boy, decomposers. So also I would include things like fungi, like mushrooms, and some insects in there too. Those are all decomposers, right? So we will, is there pink in this? No. But just know that bacteria, this represents decomposers. So everything, you can see all the arrows from all the organisms are going to be decomposed eventually, and those nutrients are going to be cycled through the earth again. So let's take a look at the other ones here. So usually on the bottom of either a food chain or a food web, you have your producers, like your plants, like a cactus, grass, the star cactus, which is kind of cute. And then you have your primary consumers that will eat the producers. Typically, these are things like herbivores, like grasshoppers, like insects, or like this kangaroo rat. Those are going to be, or a rabbit. There we go. There's one more. Those are going to be your primary consumers. And then we have all these other animals that may eat all these smaller animals here. So all of these arrows look really overwhelming, but if you create this yourself, it's very easy to start drawing connections to all these things, and it's very easy to get messy. This is like the cleanest one I could find. So, and it really just shows how all of these species are connected, so that if you got rid of, let's say, tarantulas, because, I don't know, no one in the area liked tarantulas and they just wanted them to be gone, what other species would be affected? Well, let's look at the arrows. So first off, there would be less, erase this here. There would be less to decompose, less nutrients that would cycle through the earth, and the kangaroo rat that the spider used to eat would probably increase because they don't have to worry about those dang tarantulas eating them. And these rattlesnakes may have to find a different food source, right? So food chains and food webs show how things are related in terms of what they eat, how nutrients are passed along. A food web does a little bit better job because it's more encompassing. It shows a lot more organisms in an ecosystem. Probably not a complete food web, were the ones that we just showed you, but at least you can think of a partial one, especially if you have a species that's endangered. It's helpful to create a food web so you know how to save that species, or a species that you want to bring back, and you're thinking, well, why is this animal extinct? What did it depend on? Maybe there's other animals that have gone extinct and led to that animal's extinction. So that's why they're kind of important. They help with ecology such that they can give all these details, once you've studied them, of course, to give you a map of where to look, where is there a problem, how to fix it. So ecology is essentially how organisms interact with each other, biotic interactions, and how organisms interact with their environment, abiotic. What about the other things we talked about, like the nitrogen cycle and carbon cycle? Where are they in these food webs? You'll probably see the nitrogen cycle in decomposition, but as far as like carbon and water cycle, you don't see them typically in a food web and in a food chain. Doesn't mean that they're not there. It's just not what food webs and food chains are designed to look at. So keep that in mind. It's easy to get closed-minded when you look at a food web and you say, well, that's it. That's all the ecosystem is. But as you'll see in some of the other ecosystems that we'll look at, there are so many more factors that influence everything. So in closing here, food webs and food chains show how nutrients are transferred mostly by predation, or, I forgot to put too, predation and decomposition, right? But it doesn't show everything that an organism depends on, like fire. Honestly, a lot of plants, a lot of trees especially, their seeds are activated by heat that is only achieved by fire. Um, or water and ice. A lot of animals will depend on the freezing of water, not just water. Everything needs water, but what form is it in? Does it need to be humid? Does it need to be dry? Does it need to be ice? Where is the water coming from? Where is it going? So there is a lot more cycles and processes happening in an ecosystem that we will talk about and look at. And it's so easy for me to go on and on about this because I love it. But it is super interesting once you find an area that you really like to study. And I hope that you can find at least one area, one ecosystem that you find interesting, and we can look a little deeper into that. So, all right. So for today, there is no new assignment, nothing you have to physically do to get points today. What I would like for you guys to do is look back at our other ecology lessons and look if there's anything you aren't sure of. Was there anything that you just didn't have time that day for whatever reason and need to go back on it? Nitrogen cycle. Are you, completely confident? Again, we didn't go into detail, but can you just explain maybe in a couple sentences if someone asked you? If not, just revisit it, review it, and then remember, you can retake the assignments to get a better score up to 3 times. So those assignments are open book essentially. And if you have any questions, always feel free to ask us. Haus and I are going to open up our Google Meet office hours tomorrow. So if you need to see us, just pop in, or you want to just say hi, feel free to do that. But I really just want you to feel confident, at least a little more confident in knowing the material that we already have gone over before we start talking about what we're going to be talking about in the future. So that is all. Hope you guys are doing well. Hope we see some of you tomorrow during the Google Meet hours, and take care of yourself. And that's all.